Thank you for coming, everybody. We're excited to have Ted back with us, as you heard. Ted's a local video producer. So this is our Lunch and Learn series, and it's a series of workshops on different topics. And for the coming year, we are looking for suggestions for topics that you guys want to learn about. So you can email rtober, T-O-B-E-R, at capetv.org with your suggestions. And we hope you enjoy the presentation.
Thank you very much. Okay, so today I thought we'd go over some ground that we've covered before, but I really want to try to get you guys involved more in questions and stuff. Did anybody bring a camera here today? Okay, because one of the things I would love to be able to do is have one of these workshops where people actually bring in their cameras and say, I can't figure out what this does, or I go into the menu and I'm trying to get this, but I can't find it, and something like that. I think is something we'd like to be able to do in the future to get people kind of oriented with what they're doing. But what I wanted to cover today was being able to, get over the fear of dealing with a camera menu. I mean, a lot of these cameras today are amazing, because they can think for themselves. They basically, they'll figure out, what's the right exposure, what's the right white balance, what's the right shutter speed, focus, all of that stuff. But what we want to be able to do is really get you guys thinking more about what you can manually adjust. So, sometimes you don't want to leave it up to the camera. These are the three areas that I'd like to deal with today: focus, exposure, and white balance. And for purposes of demonstration, and don't forget about controlling audio, which is another thing that can suffer a lot if you just leave it on automatic. Okay, so what we want to do is be able to understand what the menu is. We're dealing with the workhorse here at CapeTV. It's the Canon XF105. Creates great pictures. You can really get a lot out of it just leaving it on automatic. But what I have taught before and want you guys thinking about now is how much creative control you've got just by going into the menu and manually adjusting some of this stuff. So, and there it is. Some of the things that it's got, you don't have to, like if you're familiar with shooting with a digital SLR, practically all the controls are in the menu. Practically everything you want to be able to adjust except for maybe ISO and shutter speed. You have to go into the menu to be able to really play around with. With these video cameras, the 105 has a lot of stuff that's dedicated buttons. Like you can manually can switch out of automatic to manual for the iris, the amount of gain you want to put in there, how fast the shutter is, and other things. I mean, it's really kind of nicely thought out the way they said, okay, we'll have an assigned button for this, but we'll go into the menu for the other stuff. And so it's like, what if you want to go beyond what the buttons do? So one of the first things I thought we'd talk about here is how to deal with just manually focusing the thing. So we have a light over here. So I'm just going to use the audience here as demonstration. So if I get rid of the menu for now. So if we move the camera over here, and if you notice, if I leave it on automatic, I can get a focus on this person, and then it'll focus on that person. All right, so over here. Now what'll happen sometimes is if you got it on automatic, what happens is the camera looks for what's in the middle of the frame, and it tries to focus for that. Say you want to be able to have something that's composed like this, and you want to make sure that the background is definitely out of focus. This camera comes with 3 different settings for the ring that's on the camera here. Iris, zoom, and focus. And if you switch it over, what it'll do is it'll automatically, if you've got this switch set on manual, anytime you change the setting on the side of this lens here, you can then go into manual mode. So you can basically, pick what you want to be able to focus on. Say you want to be able to rack focus from a distant subject to a close one. That's, one of the situations you want to be able to have manual control on. So that's fairly simple. Other things you may want to be able to do is adjust how much depth of field you've got. Now, hopefully I'm not blinding anybody when I do this. All right, so we get a little more light on the situation here. So one of the ways to be able to figure out depth of field is the wider open you are. In other words, the lower the number on your f-stop, the more open the iris is. And you see as the numbers go up, the iris goes down. Consequently, you're increasing the depth of field. The wider open your aperture is, the less depth of field you'll have. You can pick one thing to be in focus and the rest of it can drop off. And the more, if you want more depth of field, like, you know, Citizen Kane, the movie, was widely, you know, acclaimed at the time because practically everything was in focus in a lot of those shots. The tendency in Hollywood up to that point would be to have shallow depth of field, so you'd only have one thing in focus, and the rest of the stuff would be fuzzy. And what Orson Welles did with Citizen Kane was he told his director of photography, I want everything in focus. So they pumped a lot of light onto the set so they could shoot around f/16. And in those days, film stocks were like an ISO of 20 or something like that. So you had to have a ton of light to be able to get that. But they went through all those pains so they could get that really deep depth of field. So that things like close here and way in the background will all be in focus. So you can pretty much do the same thing with this. As long as you have enough light, you can iris down. One of the things you can then do is you know, up the gain on the camera. Now on this one, it's got a button that you can actually just hit and it'll just make things, you know, exactly. It'll boost it up. Then,
what's that button called?
This is called gain. And if you look on the bottom here of the screen, this little number here, dB, if it's on 0, that's no gain at all. Okay, so that's like 0 gain. No, that's 9. This is 0 gain. And 6 plus 12. And automatic is, again, the camera saying, oh, I think I'll give it this much gain. But by having a manual control over it, you can, the other thing you might notice is the more gain you put on the image, you may not see it on this monitor, but the more gain you put on the image, the more grain you end up getting. So it's not as clean an image. So if you're going for really clean, go for 0. But one way to be able to deal with, if you want to have a framing like this, and you want to have everything in focus, up the gain, and then iris down. Not that much. But the more you iris down, the more you can keep everything in focus. And again, all these things require you to really just play around with it. You know, try it out, take the camera home, just shoot a whole bunch of different situations and see what this stuff does.
So iris down means going to f/22?
Yeah. You see, as the, this is what the actual, you know, if you look at the iris in your lens, if it's wide open like this, less depth of field. The more you stop down, as it's called, till you get like almost a pinhole kind of thing, everything's in focus. So, and then the other thing to remember is the longer the lens, like if you notice here, I can be pretty selective about, if I put the gain back to 0. So I've got this focused here, but if I zoom out, everything's in focus. So in other words, the shorter the focal length of your lens, you know, the wider the lens, the more depth of field you'll have. The more telephoto you go, this is a good way to be able to throw the background out of focus, is you use a longer lens, you have more control, you have more selective focus control. So it's always, you know, what you're doing is finding that sweet spot between what's the exposure, what's the optimum exposure for what you're doing, but also what's the optimum focal length. So you're constantly sort of balancing that. And the way to really learn it best is just to keep trying it. Shoot stuff indoors, shoot stuff outdoors, try different gains and see what happens. And again, we're going back to what controls exposure. 3 things. And this is really for still photographers, but the same things apply for the video camera. Your f-stop, what the shutter speed is, and we'll get into that, and ISO or gain. So the more sensitivity you've got, the higher the ISO number is. Used to be called ASA with film, but ISO is a good way to be able to look at it both in terms of film and digital. So you can adjust your iris, you can adjust the gain, you can also adjust the shutter speed. You don't really notice what the shutter speed is on still stuff. I mean, if you're just shooting an interview, if you're shooting at a 30th of a second, you're not going to really notice that much. But you can adjust the shutter speed on your camera so it's like 200th of a second, 1,000th of a second. This is really useful if you're shooting sports and you want to be able to get like these razor sharp images of whatever soccer player is running around, or track people or something like that. The higher your shutter speed, the more you're going to be able to freeze the image. And when you run all 30 of those images together in video, it becomes a pretty interesting effect. So any questions about exposure, combination f-stop, shutter speed, ISO? Now in video, you've got another thing you want to be able to look for, and that is, and you can't see it on this, but I'll turn it around. Will I turn it around? I'll turn it around if I move this in. If you can see the viewfinder here, down in this corner is a waveform, also called a video scope. And what the waveform does is it shows you, and it's probably clearer in this. See, in this shot, here's your actual video. What the waveform sees is the bright and the dark, and it scans from left to right. So what it does is it shows all of the components of the picture in terms of how bright they are. Optimally, what you want to be able to do, not this yet, what you want to be able to do is have the brightest stuff in your scope up around 100. White is 100, black is 0. And what you really want to be able to do is try to get as much of the picture information between 0 and 100. If it drops off below 100, you're going to have a very dark scene. If it goes up above 100, what happens in video, if you'll notice here, a lot of the top of the information is getting clipped off. That's why they call it clipping. So say we're shooting, need something bright. Oh, how about a light? So I don't know if you can see what's happening, but the waveform is going up to the top and showing what the brightest part is. And it's also going down to the bottom to show the bottom part. As you adjust the iris, the more I stop down, you see the scope goes down. The more I open it up, the more it goes towards the top. All of that white information that goes above 100 is lost. So when you get into editing and you're trying to adjust brightness or darkness of you're adjusting it in editing, you're not going to get any information out of whatever is either above 100 or below 0. So it's good every now and then to be able to flip on. It's called WFV on this, but if you can flip on the waveform, then you get a real idea of what your picture information is. These LCD viewfinders are good to give you an idea of how you're composing, even checking focus. But in terms of how much information you're actually getting on your video signal, The waveform is the best way to really be able to check that.
And you said there was a button there? to
Yes,
turn it on?
right here. It's the bottom button in the back. It's labeled WFV or WFM, depending on the camera.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, this waveform, is that integrating all lines of the video?
Yeah, you can do
Okay, so you
that.
got the right
If you've got like an outboard scope or something like that, you can do all these adjustments. Usually in the camera, what it'll do is just show all the lines from top to bottom, which is why you get sort of this quite a big scale. What you can on professional waveform monitors, you can pick what line. Like say you just want to see how it's doing up here, or you want to see how it's doing down there. You can adjust that. But in most cases, knowing what the whole picture is showing you is enough to be able to give you a good idea of what your exposure is, and if you're under control in terms of being able to get as much information as possible. Any other questions? Okay.
So if that runs in between, say it runs between 20 and 80, what's the picture going to look like? It's going to be too dark or too bright?
That means, well, if it's up, that means that, the lower on the waveform, the darker it is. The higher, the brighter. So if your blacks are up around 25, they're going to look a little washed out. They're going to be like gray, and so you'll get more information in the shadow area. But you're probably also clipping at the top, unless you got a really flat kind of, like on a cloudy day, you go outside, there's not a lot of bright, there's not a lot of deep shadows. So you end up, you've got a fairly, you don't have a huge amount of brightness range that way. So you don't have to worry about it. But indoors, sunny days, things like that, you've got pretty extreme ranges, right? So what you want to be able to do is kind of get as much as possible. Some of your highlights are going to burn out, some of your shadows are going to go too black, but you'll get enough information in the midtones to be able to get a good picture. So the same thing kind of holds true with digital SLRs. A histogram is not as accurate as, as a waveform. Because on a waveform, it's, it shows you exactly what's at 100, what's your maximum, and it shows you what's your minimum. Histogram kind of does the same thing, but you're looking at it a different way. Whatever's on the left is in the dark part of the picture. Whatever on the right is in the bright part. And what you try to do is be able to get, like on the waveform, try to get as much of your information in the middle as possible. The brighter it gets, the more you're pushing stuff over to the right, like on the top of the waveform, you'll start losing that information. And the same thing goes from the other side. If you push everything into the dark area, it's not going to look good. What a lot of people find out the first time they take out a digital SLR to shoot video with, everything looks great on the viewfinder screen. They get it back into the editing room, everything's dark. What happened? That's because you have to look at the histogram. You have to be able to see exactly what's too bright and what's too dark to be able to make that picture work. The viewfinder is usually pretty contrasty, so it'll make a lot of stuff look great when it's not. So if you can, kind of get used to, the best thing again to do is take some pictures, just take some stills. Look at the histogram, see if it's over to the right, see what that picture finally looks like. Look at it on your computer. If it's too much on the left, see what that looks like. And eventually you get an idea of, okay, if I've got the histogram balanced right in the middle there, I've got a good picture. And this illustrates that. The higher the exposure, the more stuff gets pushed over to the right. But as you can see, there's nothing here in the dark area. So what does your picture look like? It's all washed out. Over here, it's gone the other way. All the picture information is way over on the left. So it's more darkness and just a few things that are bright. And that's what this little spike over on the right indicates. So again, practicing with this stuff is really what's going to get you good at it. White balance. Now, everybody's had a problem with, if you're shooting something and mean, in this case, you don't really get to see it, but I think we'll try this. So if you look inside here, we're using sort of a tungsten balanced light. If you've noticed, there's like a piece of orange in the light here. And these things are ordinarily daylight, which is a bluer shift of light. The orange brings it back down, so it's more like what a tungsten light bulb looks like. What we're seeing here is out in the hallway, where you got fluorescent lights, things have like a bluish green cast. And in here, we're balanced for the tungsten light. So a lot of times you got to make a decision. Do I want the daylight to be the normal light, or do I want the tungsten to be the normal light? If you can't control the two, in other words, make your artificial light the same color as the daylight, or put orange gels on the things that are creating daylight in your scene. If you're not going to, if you can't control that, and a lot of times when you're shooting documentary or just on-the-fly stuff, you can't. You have to make a decision. So the way you do that is what they're doing here. There's a button on the side here. It's got a little wedge. Next to it is WB, and that's the white balance. So if you look in the lower left-hand corner there, there's an image of the sun. I don't know if you can see it, but that there. That means there are a bunch of presets on this camera. So there's a preset for daylight. There's a preset for automatic. And we don't see one for tungsten here. A lot of cameras will have a daylight automatic, and when you preset, they'll have a tungsten preset. And then there's a preset you can make, you can set for yourself. And usually what you do is you hold up like a white card, but in this case we'll use a white chair. And this button here that looks like two wedges with a dot on top of it, that's what you use to be able to set your white balance. So you just push that, and it tells you what the color temperature is. Color temperature, that's, in this case, it's 3700 K. And the way it all works, Kelvin is a measure of color temperature. And sometimes if you buy new LED light bulbs, they'll tell you what the Kelvin temperature is. Kelvin comes from, there was a physicist in the 19th century who decided, there's got to be a way to be able to determine what's the quality of light, what's the color of the light source. And what he ended up doing was he found a blacksmith who could heat up a cannonball, and the hotter that it got, it would change the wavelength of the light. And you've probably seen this, if you heat up a piece of metal, it glows orange. And that's down at the low end of Kelvin. So say you could heat your cannonball up to 3700 degrees, then you would have, the equivalent of tungsten light. If you could brighten it up, to what the daylight is about 5700 degrees Kelvin. And so if you could heat up the cannonball to 5700 degrees, then you would have the same light waves as the sun, essentially. So that's what you want to be able to do, is find, first of all, what your white balance temperature is, and then see how much of the stuff that's in your picture fits within that. And this shows you what the difference is. 2500 is gives everything outdoors a blue cast, because the actual color temperature of the sun is about 5000 Kelvin. And then if you crank it all the way up to 10,000 Kelvin, then you'll get this kind of orange look on all your stuff, which might be perfect for what you're doing, but it's not life accurate. So easiest way to set your white balance is to hold up a white card in front of the camera, or set something up, if you got a white chair or something like that, and fill the frame with the white thing and hit the white balance button. That way the camera knows exactly what color is supposed to be white, and it can figure out all the other colors from there. Any questions?
What I've been noticing when I just watch, a lot of shows, and people make a conscious effort to film stuff in one specific lighting structure.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Whether it's dark or whether it's or light. Most of it that I see now is dark. The shows are very dark. It seems like they have either, I thought it was the lighting or a colorist or something, shows like Gotham.
Right.
You know, I
Yeah.
mean, they have a
And if you look at,
mindset.
yeah, if you look at some of the like, you know, American cinematographer or something like that, they'll go through the whole process of, you know, they've got a certain amount of blue light on the set, you know, so they're kind of getting that in the camera. But then when it goes to the colorist, they can create a whole look in terms of contrast, how bright the highlights are. They can even pick out individual parts of the scene to be able to color adjust a certain way. So these days you got a ton of creative control after you've shot. What a lot of DPs will do is just go for a normal image with as much color and picture information in it as possible, and then when you're in post, change it into all these things, because you can do amazing transformations with something that just looks like a normal scene. I don't know if anybody saw Manchester by the Sea yet. They went out of their way to be able to, you know, basically shoot this to make it look as normal as possible, so that they can then have the maximum flexibility in terms of being able to create color shifts. And they're very subtle. I mean, a lot of, you know, there are a lot of, like, you know, sort of gothic horror movies, and everything's blue. You know, everything's like dark and blue, and you need, and you know, that's kind of, there's a whole vocabulary now of color in cinema that, you know, if you've got something bright and it's got a lot of, you know, individual really bright colors in it, that evokes a different emotional thing than something that's dark with a lot of blue. If something is kind of neutral toned, you know, in terms of light, but it's got a warmish cast to it, a lot of time that, you know, people relate to that as either nostalgia or a older period of time, or if you're doing, you know, like flashbacks. A lot of times what, you know, directors will do is say, okay, we'll shoot the modern day stuff normal, but flashbacks will have this kind of sepia tone. Sometimes they'll have a sepia tone and it'll be really contrasty, you know, so it'll kind of look like an old color print or something like that. So there's a ton you can do in post.
There's an interesting documentary companion to Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Which really will open your eyes up to that kind of stuff, because I think that was the first major film that was really colorized.
Yes, yeah, and the thing is, what happened is, in the old days, when you shoot your negative, and then the print would be struck, and you had some control in terms of color temperature and stuff like that with the print, but not like you have now. Now everything gets, you know, gets turned into a digital file, and you can completely restructure the brightness, color, and everything else of the scene in post. You know, so it really gives you a ton of flexibility. Sometimes it's overused. Sometimes, you know, people go, oh, I want to have this kind of effect, and they just, you know, do it for the whole film, and it gets a little tedious after a while. Soderbergh's Traffic, you know, all the stuff that was in the United States had a certain color, and everything that was, you know, in Afghanistan had this other kind of gritty kind of look. So you always knew where you were, but it, you know, after a while it was kind of like, oh, you know, let's see a normal picture or something. Again, it's all taste, it's emotion, it's what you're going for to try to get your audience to pick up on. And the other thing I wanted to get into is the whole idea of being able to control your audio on these cameras. Even with a digital SLR, you can pick between manual and automatic. And they all do a pretty good job in terms of being able to pick out for you, you know, what's an average audio level. What I found is if you put these cameras on automatic, and you can do that again with the switch up here. There's a little thing that, if you look in here, you can go from automatic to manual. Manual, it engages these volume controls that are at the top of the camera. So you can actually say, okay, this is as you can just look at the, let me get rid of the waveform here so I can see what I'm looking at. We don't have this on. You can hear it. Yeah. So you see, if the thing is like looking at whatever the audio signal is in there, it tries to bring it up as much as possible. And sometimes you don't want that. Sometimes you just want to have whoever your key person is, the person who's closest to the microphone, they've got the right audio level, and then everything else kind of falls off. That's why if you watch the news, usually whoever is like sitting at the desk on TV or something like that is delivering the news. 15 feet away from them, people are having like a normal conversation about what the next segment is or who's going to be coming in next or stuff like that, and you really can't hear them because what they've done is they've controlled down the audio on the microphones, on the lav mics that are sitting on the talent. So all you're doing is picking up whatever sounds good like 6 inches away from the microphone. It's not picking up the stuff that's 20 feet away from the microphone. So if you're in a loud situation and you can put a lavalier microphone on somebody and you can manually control the audio, you can get rid of a lot of that background noise.
So it doesn't matter which lavalier mic, are there any?
No, I mean the one I'm wearing today is a Sony and it's good. Sennheiser makes one. There are a couple of other, like Electrosonics makes one of the most durable ones. In fact, when they mic up football players, a lot of times that'll be an electrosonic wireless mic just because they're made like tanks. You can basically you can get tackled. you can be tackled by a linebacker and the thing will still run, so those are really good. But any lavalier mic, even if it's hardwired, will do a lot for you in terms of being able to just isolate what the speaker is saying. In a lot of cases, if you're shooting in a live situation outdoors, what sound recorders on a feature film will do is put a wireless mic on everybody. If you've ever watched Wicked Tuna, everybody who's in the boat or on land or stuff like that, every one of them has an individual microphone. And that gets recorded on a multi-track digital recorder. So when you get back into editing, you have a separate signal for every single person, which clears up a lot of headaches. Because trying to get one microphone to pick up everything right is very tough. Even if you've got a boom mic that you can hang, right over individual people, sometimes if you got a dialogue going, you have to have 2 mics. So if you can hide a wireless mic on somebody, that makes it even better because that way it doesn't look like they're mic'd, but you get the cleanest possible audio signal. So I think we're pretty much covered what I wanted to do. Those of you who are into a time lapse, there's you can download the manual for this off of the Canon website, and it's got 160 pages of how to run this thing. So one of the things that if we had more time I would get into, but ran out of time right now, is how to shoot time-lapse on this thing. So I might do a whole workshop on time-lapse, shooting it with your digital SLR, shooting it with this, because it's something that people want to be able to know. It's a really cool effect. And practically every documentary you see now has a time-lapse view of something that they use as a transition to go from one thing to another. The whole opening sequence, the whole title sequence of House of Cards is all time-lapse. So it's more common now because more cameras can do it. So hopefully that'll be one of the things we get into in the future. Any other questions for today, though?
Just, how did you get that to read the volume? Just turn it to manual and it started reading the volume?
Yes. Yeah, actually what I did is it's on manual now with the volume set all the way down.
Oh,
as soon as you flip it over to automatic, then it'll start, it'll pick up whatever it is. If I was standing over there, it would crank it up so it would hear that. And it takes a little bit of time for it to adjust automatically. So, if somebody starts talking real loud like that, you see it'll grab it down very slowly. And so it's not an abrupt thing. It's pretty good, but it's not as good as being able to, manually adjust the thing.
Okay, and so whether it's manual or automatic, it will still show the...
Yeah, it'll still show...
You have a selector for what's in the viewfinder.
Yeah, because what it'll do is it'll always show, and when the peak, it'll show where the peak is, whether the loudest thing was that it last recorded, and then it'll remember that for about a half second, and then it'll readjust to wherever the next peak is. So it's much easier to read than if you were just looking at the things bouncing back and forth. So, that's it for today. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Hope we shed a little light on your menu. And again, take whatever camera you're using, go into that menu. If you kept the manual for the camera, now's the time to open it up and start going through it and just check out what all that stuff does. And you'll be able to make some even better videos.